Unsolved.
Who knew the dog was out? Who knew the dog was out? Who knew the dog was out? Well, first, the dog was given to JonBenet around the summer of 1994, making the dog about 2.5 years old at the time of JonBenet's death. And it wasn't a birthday present as many describe it. Well, the first misconception about the dog being away from the Ramsey's house the night JonBenet died is the dog went over to the Barnhill residence sometime before Christmas, maybe as early as December 23rd. So the dog wasn't just surprisingly out that one night. The dog spent a lot of time over at the Barnhill's house. Even if it wasn't official, the dog considered himself moved on. Joe Barnhill, who lives across the street, said he stowed the Christmas bicycle John Ramsey bought for JonBenet until Christmas Eve. And I read somewhere else that John Ramsey got the bicycle at about 9 p.m. Christmas Eve. And I read in another newspaper article that this was the last time that Joe Barnhill talked to John Ramsey prior to JonBenet's death. So it looks like the dog spent Christmas Day over at the Barnhill's house. The people who knew for certain that the dog was out were John Ramsey and Patsy Ramsey and their kids, Joe and Betty Barnhill and their boarder, Glenn Meyer, and Mike and Pam Archuleta, the pilot and his wife. And that's all. Others who might have known include everyone at Fleet White's Christmas dinner, Stuart and Roxy Walker, Glenn and Susan Stein, John and Barbara Fernie, the housekeeper Linda Hoffman, and maybe some of the neighbors. I read in a newspaper article too that the neighbors were aware of the dog staying often over at the Barnhill house. And the dog most likely would have been a problem for the killer. The dog most likely would have found JonBenet's dead body that morning. And the dog was 2.5 years old.
Thank you to everybody who has subscribed to my channel, the Nancy Drew channel.
Dogs are much smarter than people give them credit for, like my dog. I was outside in my bare feet with my dog, and I stepped on a shingle. It scraped me, and I asked my dog, said, "How do you think that feels?" And he said, "Roof, roof." And then I said, "This shingle doesn't belong here. Where's it go?" And he said, Roof, roof. Then I asked him, what's Einstein's famous formula? E equals mc squared. But then my dog is kind of really smart.